On behalf of Hindu Center and my own self. I am Sadashiv. I am a Hinduism teacher trained at Hindu Center Singapore, and we have the pleasure of running these easy Hinduism talks. Till today, it had always been run as one-to-one sessions or class sessions at the center, and today is our first attempt at running this on Zoom. So in case there are some glitches, please bear with us, but I think it should hopefully be quite smooth. So welcome again, and we will start with our opening prayers. Vakratunda Mahakaya Suryakoti Samaprabha Nirvighnam Kuru Me Deva Sarvakaryeshu Sarvada Saraswati Namastubhyam Varade Kamarupini Vidyarambham Karishyami Siddhir Bhavatu Me Sada Gurur Brahma Gurur Vishnu Gurur Devo Maheshwara Guru Sakshat Param Brahma Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. So today's talk is on the, yes?
Before you start, can you put it on slideshow mode?
Okay.
Thank you.
How is that?
So today's talk is on the significance of Hindu temple architecture. And as you can imagine, it is a vast subject, probably something that can take an entire graduate course, if not at least one semester. And our attempt is to try and condense as much of it as possible, at least the key highlights, in this 1 hour. So that's going to be quite a challenge, as you can imagine. But let us see how far we can cover the topic and give it some justice. And we will try, and my objective was that we try and cover enough material that will satisfy our curiosity when it comes to these three questions. What underlies the grandeur of our temples? And there is no question about how grand our Hindu temples are. And whether they are just spectacular product of man's artistic talents alone, or is there further stuff behind that beyond merely being talents. I mean, even building a bridge needs talent, even building a computer needs talent, but what's special about Hindu temples? And then finally, also, how do our temples help the devotee, which means us, connect with God or Brahman as we know it? So hopefully, let us see whether we can, through today's presentation, answer all these three questions. I'm going to, this is how I'm going to cover the topic this evening. First, I will draw and try to establish the link between our Hindu scriptures and temple architecture, because as we know, Sanatana Dharma is a very logical, almost scientific faith, and therefore, almost anything that we do, we hark back to our Hindu scriptures, and let us see the link between the scriptures and temple architecture. Next, what are the specific texts which are the foundational guides for temple architecture? Then, what is the key concept, the core concept underlying a Hindu temple? And then a little bit of a history of temple building so that we know how the evolution has taken place, and into three main schools, and I'll share with you what those are. Then some of the key features and contrasts of the Northern and South Indian temple architecture traditions, because these are the two key traditions. Then a concept of the Hindu temple layout. I mean, what constitutes a temple? Because there is a physical structure there. What are the usual construction processes? In brief, of course, it's an overview. And then the key design elements, and this is what I think many of us will be quite keen on. Then what are the main parts of a Hindu temple? What are its functions? What are the characteristics? And I will try and share with you quite a few illustrative examples to give a good picture of what the parts of a temple are and their functions. Finally, I'll also take us through a tour of some of the prominent Hindu temple structures in Singapore. And before that, you would have already seen some of the structures elsewhere. And of course, then we will conclude with Q&A. I hope that if we can do this within an hour or thereabouts, it will be, I think, a success for all of us. Thank you. Now, talking about the significance of temple architecture, Hindu temple architecture, architecture is nothing but art. You know? Otherwise, a hovel or a hut does not qualify itself to be called as an architecture's dream, right? So it has to be of a particular design, and therefore art and architecture, when I use the word architecture, art is implied in architecture, and it appeals to the higher self within us. It is going beyond the mundane, just as faith is, meaning religious faith, faith in God, faith in the divine, faith in the supreme. Okay? And both of these appeal to us and take us to what I would call a transcendental plane, which elevates us, it elevates our human spirit and tries to then make us answer the question as to why we were brought in this form and shape into this Jagat or this universe. And so it elevates us to our noblest sort of, expectations and what's within each of us, waiting to want to be expressed. And in Hinduism, in our great Sanatana Dharma, art and faith, and therefore architecture and faith, are intertwined at every level. Anything that we look at from a faith perspective has art built into it, whether it's music, dance, temple architecture, everything connected to the divine has art inbuilt in it. With that as a backdrop, let us now take a look at where this stems from. And so I want to very quickly take you through some of the key Hindu scriptures, or Shastras as we call it, and see where this all stemmed from or stems from. Okay? We know that the Shastras essentially comprise two portions, Apaurushaya and Paurusheya. And for those who may not know the exact meaning of these Sanskrit words, essentially it means Apaurushaya means that which is not of Purusha, of human origin, that means of non-human origin or divine origin, those that have been revealed to us, to the great sages, and who have been kind enough and generous to pass it on to us. And then Paurusheya are those of human origin. Quite obviously, those of non-human or divine origin are considered as the final pramana or proof of anything that we live by for a Hindu. And so we are going to basically take a look at the Apaurushaya Shastras, and these are essentially made up of two broad bundles of scriptures, and these are huge bundles. So these are of enormous magnitude, and they are the Vedas, which of course all of us have heard of, and the Agamas. Okay? And so both of them are of divine origin. Now, the Vedas are the oldest known scriptures in the world. I won't go in great detail into that. I want to touch a little bit more on Agamas today, and because there is a certain relevance to this, there is a bit of relevance of Vedas too, which we will see how it comes about. Okay? But literally, Agamas are those that have been handed down, or they are traditional doctrines. Okay, and of course they were then converted into texts and theological treatises, and from them rose the origins of our rituals, or tantras as they are known as. Okay, and tantric literature. And this is somewhere around the the 1st to 3rd century CE in the Common Era. Okay, and then all the way till the 15th century of the current Common Era, also known as AD. Okay, we use the term Common Era. Moving on, if we take a look at the Vedas, and I want to sort of take you through where some of these elements of architectural relevance have been built in. Okay, so the Vedas, we know there are 4 Vedas, etc. But then there are also what are known as the Upavedas, or the auxiliary supporting texts for the main Vedas. And within that, there is one Upaveda called the auxiliary Veda or additional Veda called the Gandharva Veda, which is devoted mainly to the performing arts of music, dance, and drama. And you may wonder what has this got to do with architecture, and you will realize it. Just keep this at the back of the mind that there is this Veda, and you'll see as we unfold today's talk how it relates into it. Okay? There are beyond the Upavedas, there is also something called the Veda Angas, which are the essential components that are needed to understand the Vedas. And in that, I won't go through all the 6. The most relevant one for this evening's talk is the what I would call as the Kalpa, okay, a Kalpa or the Kalpa Sutras, and these are the modes of performance of rituals, and we will see how that is linked further down the line. So just keep in mind this Gandharva Veda and Kalpa Sutras. We move on now from the Vedas to the more interesting Agamas, but I want to draw a few distinctions between the two. Okay? Now the Vedas were monistic, or emphasizing in self and Brahman as being same. That means the self and the supreme are nothing but the same, and that we are a microcosm of the microcosm, and we therefore are part of the supreme. Okay? The Agamas, on the other hand, talk about the concept of duality, which means there is a worshipper and there is a worship. Of course, finally culminating in the worshipper joining the worship. Okay? But there is this concept of duality, of being different between the supreme and me as a human being, as a worshipper. The next important distinction is the Vedas were centered on fire worship at home, okay? And there was not much of an emphasis on temple worship, as belief was in Brahman as a formless Brahman. So formless Brahman therefore didn't need to have imagery, icons, buildings, etc. All we did was fire worship, you know? Agni homas. And the practices were therefore centered around yajnas by way of offerings to Agni. On the other hand, when it came to Agamas, the Agamas provided human beings the opportunity for individual worship, okay? Which also meant the concept of an Ishta Devata, that means a personal God, because I have my own likes and dislikes. I am different from other human beings, and therefore each of us have also our own needs, our aspirations, our likings, and therefore it sort of provided for this development of images and iconography. Okay? And then the other major separation was the Vedas allowed for worship to be done externally, but in a very collective effort, whereas the Agamas allowed for both worship at home and external worship, especially using imagery and icons, whereas the Vedas allowed for collective worship, but again in the form of homas and rituals of fire worship. Okay? Whereas the Agamas led towards the need for imagery and iconography and paintings and sculptures, etc., and the use of devatas. So you can see the broad now differentiation between the two. And finally, therefore, it had a need to obviously describe about temple architecture, the forms, because once you start talking of imagery and icons and a personalized God, it needs to have a form, and it needs to have a look around it, and then I have to place it in a place of worship, and therefore the concept of temple, etc., came about. And so what we today see is that, and this is something that many of us may not have realized, at least I did not realize earlier, that a lot of what we do as worship in the temples are of agamic origin and not so much of Vedic origin. And of course, there are Vedic rites going on in the temple in the form of homas, but all the rituals and all the forms and all the sculptures, etc., are basically of agamic origin. So I'm going to sort of jump through here. So this around the 6th century or 7th century, this temple culture gathered strength, okay, as many agamas were now converted from their revelations into written texts and manuals. Okay? Then the tradition began to flourish even further when the Bhakti school emerged around the 10th or 11th century of the Common Era or Anno Domini, which means that this was centered around devotion to God, and devotion to God means you need a form. You know, it cannot be a formless God, at least for the mundane or the lay person, and therefore it even further established this whole concept of need for imagery and a location for keeping such imagery. Now, each agama consists basically of 4 parts, just like the Vedas also consists of 4 parts, right? And they are called the padas: Jnana pada for knowledge, Yoga pada for meditation, Kriya pada for rituals, and Charyapada for the ways of worship. Okay? So the key thing is here to understand is that these last two segments, the Kriyapada and the Charyapada, were the ones that dealt directly with both the ritual, the processes, how do I carry about my showing of respect, of love, for affection to my God through by way of rituals, and also Charyapada is actually more for temple priests, etc., as to how they should carry out their duties and what are the aspects and what are the austerities they have to maintain in terms of their own purity in conduct and cleanliness. So therefore, in effect, what has happened is that the Agamas, through these established the whole process of temple worship. Agamas say, if an image is to be worshipped, it has to be worship worthy. Then the rituals or sequences of worship become relevant only in the context of an adorable icon, an icon that I respond to, that I love, that I have an affection for, installed in the heart of a shrine. Okay? So the rituals are only connected with an adorable icon, and therefore the icon is supreme. Okay? And the icon is meaningful when its shrine aptly reflects its glory. You can't have an adorable icon sitting in a horrible location or a very pedestrian looking location, and therefore the glory of the shrine becomes very important. And that such a temple, now it is being called a temple, that shrine should be in harmony with the essential characteristics of its presiding deity. And finally, the Agamas believe that the temple must be built for the idol and not an idol that's got ready for a temple already built, which means the idol is the key and the temple is subsidiary to the idol. And thus we see how the connection, I hope you're able to see the connection between how the Agamas were the starting points for the whole process of iconography, imagery, and therefore the place where such images are kept and the temple. It's a bit of a circuitous argument, as you can see, or process, I won't say argument, or the way it happened, but I thought it's important for us to understand, then we can go ahead and understand other things. Okay, and of course the last point being the temple is nothing but an expanded reflection of the icon. Okay, the icon that the temple has to reflect that, therefore the grandioseness or grandeur of the temple. Now agamic texts therefore now provided manuals with rules for arts and crafts. Okay, and one of the first one is known as the Shilpa Shastras, okay, which is the science of Shilpa. Shilpa means arts and crafts, and it deals with all sorts of arts and crafts, right from statues, icons, stone murals, painting, carpentry, pottery, jewelry, dyeing, textiles, farriery. Farriery means how to shoe the horses, and even more. So you can see it's unimaginably wide, okay? And it provided, interestingly, the design rules, the principles, and the standards, so that there would be a high quality that is maintained. Okay? And therefore, you can think of the Shilpa Shastras and manuals, as user manuals for sculpture and Hindu iconography. They prescribe the proportions for the sculpturing of the figures, their composition, the meaning for each of the poses, the attitudes that are shown, etc., etc. So that is the Shilpa Shastras that arose as part of agamic texts. The other important one that arose are the Vastu Shastras, okay, which is to do with pure building architecture, okay, which is around the building of not just merely temples, but also it then expanded to include houses, forts, apartments, villages, town layouts, and today it is very popular. This is one of the ways in which builders sell, especially in India, that whether it satisfies Vastu or not. Okay? Even Chinese, of course, believe a similar concept of Feng Shui. Okay? We'll touch upon that for just a slide or two. Now, I think I already mentioned about the term Shilpa, but what's important is, therefore, the Shilpa Shastra involved now a whole lot of people who had to understand and follow these standards, which included the sculptor, the potter, the perfumer, the wheelwright, the one who makes the wheels, the painter, weaver, architects, dancers, musicians, arts of love, and all others. Okay, so it consists of art, skill, craft, labor, ingenuity, creative abilities, ritual, form, everything is all built in. And hence one of my early slides where we talked about how art and faith therefore are interlinked in our Sanatana Dharma. Let's have a quick look at Vastu Shastra. I'm not going to spend too much time on that. Vastu basically derives from the word vas, meaning to reside, or it also means dwelling of human beings and of gods. Okay, and the adherence to Vastu processes or Vastu science is supposed to enhance the well-being and reduce the what I would call as the ill-being or the discomfort of people. But let us bear in mind that this doesn't mean following Vastu Shastra will take away anything that is that will apply to me or to each of us by way of the law of karma. Whatever is karmic, those karmic results we have to necessarily face. But Vastu Shastra could mitigate or lessen some of the thing and enhance some of the key features through the use of Vastu. And Vastu essentially incorporates the laws of nature. It talks of the building as being a living organism, and we know that because buildings even today, RCC structures, that means reinforced concrete structures, don't last probably beyond 100 years, and that's why they get pulled down 80 to 100 years. So they are living just like us. They are born, they survive, and then they get destroyed, right? And so Vastu Shastra recognizes this. It also talks about the importance of the cardinal directions, which mean the 8 directions, north, south, east, west, and the subsidiary 4 other directions. And it draws the power from nature and from the devatas, who are what are known as the gatekeepers or the protectors of these 8 directions, or Ashtadikpalas as they are called in our Sanatana Dharma. And so Vastu determines the location of activity points in the buildings so that they will be in harmony with all the forces of nature and with the relevant gods. And we talk of the key 5 elements: fire, water, earth, and space. And so Vastu science, according to the picture on the right, talks about how north, east is associated being with water, northwest with air, southwest with earth, and southeast with fire. And accordingly, therefore, the various locations of a building, within a building, have to be placed. And there is also the concept of a Vastu Purusha. Okay, Vastu Purusha being there is a divine or a human godlike entity embedded in each plot or living area, and therefore you satisfy the needs of that Vastu Purusha and his divine needs, and therefore these are connected in a way. All these are connected therefore in the form of the directions being linked to concerned gods and also the concerned planets. So Vastu therefore basically is a design for no imbalance overall. It's reducing the imbalance and also drawing the interrelationship between ecology, the passive energy that we see, and living beings. So now I go back to Agamas. That was just to give you the fact that these are the 2 key texts, the Shilpa Shastras and the Vastu Shastras. And Agamas refer to temple architecture through this particular technical term called Devalaya Vastu Shilpa, or in Sanskrit, Deva Alaya means Deva we know. Alaya is, even in Tamil we say Alayam, or abode, residence, and therefore Devalaya is nothing but the abode of God. Similarly, we say Himalaya, which is Him means snow, the abode of snow is Himalaya. Okay? So Devalaya, so we will going forward use this term Devalaya Vastu Shilpa for temple architecture. Okay? And the Shilpa Shastras provide these elaborate rules, and there are 3 key elements to a temple structure, which basically talks of the sthala or the site, the tirtha or the temple tank, and then the murti or the idol. Of course, unfortunately, nowadays in major metropolises like Singapore, or even for that matter Chennai, the temple tank is slowly being lost or being ignored. But essentially, the Shilpa Shastras talk of these 3 as being key. In fact, there is one more that is known as the sthala vriksha, which means the tree. There should be a tree also, which is the, so if you see in some of the traditional temples in India, there will be a banyan tree, or there will be a bo tree, a fig tree, bodhi tree in around the temple time. So these are three key parts of a consideration in the Shilpa Shastras. And the Vastu Shastra texts, by the way, happen to be, the principal treatises are Manasara and Mayamata, and there is one more called Silpasara. I have not added it there. And the Mayamata came from South India, and it essentially came from Shaiva literature or Shiva-related literature around the Chola period. And it actually defines, interestingly, Vastu as an arrangement of space, which I found it very beautiful. It talks about an arrangement of space anywhere where mortals and immortals reside. So that's what basically Vastu Shastra is doing, and Mayamata helps in doing that. And now both these subjects are also intertwined with astrology. I showed you the previous slide about how we talk about the grahas or the planets. And when we talk about planets, by the way, in Hinduism or the grahas, we are not talking about just the physical planets. The physical planets are only manifestations of powers that reside within these planets. Okay? So the graha are those manifestations of the power. And therefore, there is a linkage between powers we know, between nature, which is again power and energy of a certain kind, and the different gods and the directions. Now, having therefore clearly seen what the texts are and how therefore from Agamic literature the texts were formed and they formed the manuals, we now know that the Hindu temple is not merely a building. Okay? It is an image. It is a conception of divinity, and it centers around the idol or the icon. As we said earlier, the temple must be built for the icon, and it is not that it's an idol that got ready for a temple already built. So we can never think of a temple without an idol. And that is the reason why when we go to Angkor Wat or some of, even until recently, the Prambanan temples in Indonesia, these were temples without icons inside, and therefore they are not having any more the divine energy. Until recently, Prambanan was very recently, I think, reconsecrated, I think 2 or 3 months ago, which was such a delight to hear. I will show you that towards the end. I'm going to now move on to the next part of the topic, which is around a historic perspective. Very quickly, the whole concept of temple building started towards the early part of the Common Era, when the Guptas and the Gupta Empire, where the concept of Devalaya became evident. Okay? And the oldest surviving shrines, which are made of bricks, and they are in the 3rd and 4th century, and they probably have been temporary structures mainly for community worship. So because the concept of the individualized God and the agamic structures had not yet become established. Okay? So it was still more Vedic, and there are some early surviving temples, and they're now between the 3rd to 6th centuries in various places. And the key point I want to make in these last two bullets are that they initially were with flat roofs, and then later on they started having pyramidical structures on top, like certain Vishnu temples at Devghar, etc. in Madhya Pradesh and Uttar Pradesh, central India. Now, these were the major kingdoms that were there in India. And what happened was that what you're seeing is that these were what we call as a northern school emerged over a period of time. Okay? And these were the great clans of Chandelas, the Rashtrakutas, and the Utkalas, etc., the Gujaras and Pratiharas in the north, and the Magadha kingdoms, the post Gupta dynasty, and this became the northern school, as we call it. And then came about what we call as the Chalukyas, the Vengis, the Kadambas, etc., in more towards north, slightly north of South India, or you can almost call it central India, lower central India. And then finally came the third school, or the southern school, which was in the deep south, which comprised of the Pallavas, the Pandyas, the Cheras, and there's one more missing there, the Cholas, which is not written in the back. In fact, the Cholas are very, very prominent as temple builders. So these major schools over a period of time, of course, emerged. Okay? And we'll see what each of these schools basically presented. So the first of the schools was the northern school, which also goes by the name the Nagara school. Okay, and the typical structure would be seen in Orissa, Central India, Gujarat, Rajasthan, and you can see how they look like. And the key features were the entire temple is on a stone platform with steps that lead up to it. Okay? The one on the left is the Khajuraho temple, by the way. The one on the right, I could not find exactly what reference it was, but I can find out and let you know. And they do not have elaborate boundary walls, as you can see. Some may not even have walls because they're just placed on pedestals. And they would have one or more towers. They're called shikharas, towers. And the Garbhagriha, or the Sanctum Sanctorum, was always under the tallest tower. So this was the Nagara style. Okay? The second style is the major style, is the Dravida, or the South Indian style. And this was started by around the Pallavas, okay, the Pallava kingdoms, okay, and then enhanced substantially by the Cholas, the Pandyas, the Nayaks, and the Vijayanagar kings. Okay, the Nayaks were around Madurai, deep south, just along with the Pandyas, okay? And the Vijayanagar kings were around the area of present-day Karnataka. Okay? And the key features of the Dravida style is that often there was at least one grand gopura or entrance tower, okay? And then the temple itself is invariably enclosed by a boundary wall, almost always. It was very rarely without a boundary wall called a prakara. And the Sanctum Sanctorum is topped by a shikhara called a vimana. In this case, in the Dravida style, it's called a vimana, okay? Which is the Sanctum Sanctorum, or Garbhagriha. We used that term earlier, Garbhagriha. Garbha meaning womb and Griha meaning room. So the womb room. And the Vimana in the South Indian style is like a stepped pyramid, as you can see on the left. That's this golden Vimana that you can see, which is beautiful. It's the Sripuram temple in Vellore. And while for the northern, if you saw, the Vimana was curved. Okay, sorry, the Shikhara was curved. So these are the some key differences. And in South India, the Shikhara is in fact, the term Shikhara is used. The Shikhara only refers to the topmost part of the Vimana because it is curved, as you can see. So we call that Shikhara, or the head. Shikhar means head, so Shikhara is the crown, rather. Crown element. And then came the third school called the Vesara school. The Chalukyas I showed you in the central portion of India, the Chalukyas, Vengis. This developed in the Karnataka Kuntala Desha, or the Chalukyas, where the Chalukyas removed. And it was further dramatically improved by the Hoysala kingdoms. Okay, these were absolutely wonderful, which is in the Hampi and Halebid area. Okay, and these were essentially hybrids, which are marked by architectural experimentation. And from that you can see that the Shikhara on the left is of a Nagara style, and the Shikhara on the right is more of a Vimana style, which is a South Indian style. So quite clearly they were using, this is by the way as at a place called Padakkal, okay? And there were lots of places, Aihole, Pattadakkal, okay? And I'm not going to go through each of these, but there were all kinds of shapes they were experimenting: horseshoe shaped, arrow shaped, trapezoid shaped. So they tried. They were in experimentation mode. Okay? And in fact, in Badami, there's a Trikuta temples which are with 3 Garbhagrihas, or 3 Sanctum Sanctorums. Okay. So this was the 3 styles. But I'm going to, for today's purpose, basically focus on the 2 major styles, which is Nagara and Dravida, and later on focus more on the Dravida style because they were the greatest temple builders finally of all in terms of the sheer grandiosity that happened. So going back in the Nagara style, we'll now take a look at the layouts. That means we now start looking at the components of a temple. And basically what you're seeing is the layout of a Nagara style layout. Okay. So it has got a inner sanctum sanctorum, Garbhagriha. Okay. It is topped by an Amalaka. Amalaka is like a gooseberry. That's why it's called a Amalaka. Okay. It had a roundish stone. And then it has got secondary towers. They've got special names, Urushringa, etc. Then there's a vestibule or a connecting corridor to the great hall of Mahamandapa. Okay. And then there is the Mandapa. And then there is an entrance Mandapa. Mandapa means pavilion in Sanskrit. Mandapa is, we use the same word mandap in Hindi, and in Tamil we say mandapam. Okay. Or most South Indian languages say mandapam. So that is the northern style. And then the Dravida style, whereas you see slight differences. And you had in the early stages, the Gopura was quite small with a mandapa or pavilion or hall. And then the Vimana with a Shikhara on top. And then in the later stages, the Gopura started gaining importance and it became a Raja Gopuram. So you see, which is what we see today in most South Indian temples. Okay, Dravida temples, and they also incorporated certain other features, and we will look at each of these in greater detail. Okay, Mahamandapam and then Garbhagriha. So just giving you an overview. Okay, and so the architecture essentially involves a multiple set of ideas. Okay, and the traditional architecture has more symbolic meanings than any other cultures. Okay, it's very, very articulated. It has been very well described in all the Shastras as to why each of these have a certain meaning, why a certain thing has to be of a certain shape and size, and which direction it should face, and why it should be different for a Vishnu, to a Shiva, to a Subramanya, to a Ganapati, or a Lakshmi temple. So the articulation of all the meanings and symbolic is very high in our traditional architecture. Finally, the temple is an image of cosmic man and also symbolizes the body of God on a macrocosmic plane. So you'll find both elements. That means you'll find the micro-human element represented in the temple, and we'll see that shortly. And also this grand vision of the macrocosmos that Ishvara or the supreme being is capable of or has given us. And therefore, it symbolizes both the macro and the microcosmic plane. And the names of various parts of the temple are the very names we use for the human body, thus making this temple as personal as it can get. That means we are able to relate to it. And that is the nature of our architectural sort of brilliance of the whole process. Now, the layout of the temple essentially, you remember earlier we had talked about the Vastu Purusha, that every ground has got a Vastu Purusha, divine man god, and so essentially the temple too has a Vastu Purusha, and what we are seeing on top is the side view of this Vastu Purusha, and the bottom is the plan view or the top view of the Vastu Purusha. And essentially what therefore the layout of the temple lays out is that every part of this Vastu Purusha is represented in the temple, starting with the head, which is exactly proportionately in line with the Garbhagriha or the womb where the deity or the presiding deity is placed, along with on top of the presiding deity, the tower that covers and provides its grace and power. Okay? Followed by the body, which is represented by the Mantapa or the pavilion, followed then by the Mooladhara Chakra, because we know that the body has got these various chakras, which are energy centers that each of us has or human beings have, and therefore it starts with the Mooladhara at the very base of our being, okay, which is represented by the Dvajasthamba, okay, and then all the way down to the feet, which is represented by the entrance or the Gopura, which is the entrance tower of the temple. And therefore, the Vastu Purusha is essentially lying in every temple. And so the next time we visit a temple, we can imagine this in front of our eyes from what we have learned here. Okay. And as I said earlier, the architectural names include actually every part and parcel of our human body. The Shikha, which is the crest, Shira, the head, Nasika, the nose, Karna, our ears, Kantha, our throat, Gala or Griva, our neck, Uru, thigh, Jangha, our shank, which means between the knee and the ankle, the length of the leg, our feet, and then finally even the footprint. So all of these are used as part and parcel of a temple architecture. Okay, and Pada is the column. Jangha is parts of the superstructure over the base. Those columns that we see in the temple, those are it. I talked about Gala, Griva. I talked about the Nasika. Any nose-shaped architectural part is called a Nasika. Okay? And then we move on. Therefore, when we take the Vimana, a Dravida Vimana on the left, you will find that the names given to it are in proportion to the figure of a Devata, or especially the particular Devata who is the presiding deity sitting under the Vimana. And it represents in proportion, that is the beauty here, of the head, in fact, starting with his tuft, his whole hair, his kesha or his hair, followed by the face, the neck, the shoulders, the chest, the body, the seat, the knee, and then, of course, the bottom portion with the adhishtanam or the base, where he's resting, including then the foot or the pada. Okay? And that's how there is a relationship drawn in architecture through the Shilpa Shastras to all of these. Now, the Shilpa Shastra, Shiva Prakasha, this is another Shilpa text, by the way. It describes 16 types of temple layouts. I won't go through each of them. They are squares, rectangles, circles, ellipses, diamonds, arrows, fish, back of a tortoise, conch shape, crescent shape, pot shape, sword shape, lotus shape, etc. And some of them are specific for certain kinds of deities, like Kamala, Kumbha, Kurma, and Shankha, which is lotus, pot, tortoise shell, and the conch are applied for Shiva and Vishnu. Devi temples are square, rectangular, fish, diamond, sword shaped, etc. Okay? But finally, you'll find that the square or rectangular shape is considered the most auspicious and the best of all. So a large number of temples do follow either square or rectangular shapes, but there are temples of other shapes too, okay? Including horseshoe shaped temples. Here is the layout of the Meenakshi temple in Madurai. You can see that it is a rectangular or Agatra layout. And the Meenakshi temple is a fantastic piece of architecture. It has 16 towers, which of course were not all built at the same time. They were built across the rules of several emperors and kings, starting with the Pandya, Cholas, and then the Vijayanagar kings who came and conquered the south, and then of course ending with the Nayak kings. Okay? So they all added each of them tower, and so this is a typical rectangular layout that you'll find in many Dravida temples, including our own temples here in Singapore. So you might wonder that the plot of land in which the temple may be sitting may not be rectangular in shape. So the plot might, because the plot has got other things that might be required, or it might have been donated as such, and obviously the temple wouldn't want to unnecessarily lose that plot. But the temple premises proper per se will always have a regular shape and will be one of these 16 shapes, most likely a rectangular or square shape, including Hindu temples, by the way, outside of India. Moving on, I'm going to give you a very quick outline of the temple construction process. It's very detailed, and these are all given in the Shilpa Shastra, and in fact, this is from the Vastu and Shilpa Shastra combined. Okay, it starts with ground ceremony of Bhu Pariksha. Bhu means ground. Okay, site selection, site examination. Sila Pariksha, choosing the right materials. whether stone, because there are also wooden, imagery. Okay, what kind of stone? Sandstone, granite, invariably, or marble. Northern Indian temples often chosen marble. Southern Indian temples, often it is sandstone or granite. Okay, then Karshana, the crops would be grown in that spot so that to see whether it has got prosperity, whether that land is fertile. You wouldn't build a temple in an infertile place. Then they would carry out Vastu Puja, which today even is being carried out even for house building. Okay, and then it goes on to laying the foundation stone, and then the land is further purified, and then the water is mixed, and under the main deities Vimana, which means the presiding deities Vimana, are placed pots filled with Navaratnas, with 9 gemstones, Navadhanyas, 9 different what do you call, like paddy, husk, etc. Okay, and then Navakhanijas, or 9 minerals. Okay, and they are all put in the pit, and then they are given put in that spot where the main deity is going to be seated, or is going to be put further, installed later. And then, of course, comes the final, when the building process takes place, and after that comes the placing of the top stone over the gopura, over the prakara, etc. And then the garbhanyasa. Garbha, we know, is womb. That means another pot filled with 5 various metals are placed at the place of the main deity on top of the main Vimana. So you'll see on top of the Vimana always there'll be a kalasha or a pot. Okay? And these are filled with various metals and other grains. Yeah. When we talked of dhanya, I couldn't get that word grain, the navadhanyas. And so they are kept there because these have got the propensity and ability to attract energies and to enable the energizing of the vigraha or the statue. And then the prana pratishtha takes place, which is when the main deity is charged. Because until then, the deity is as much as like a picture or image or an idol sitting in your shop, which has not had any powers. Okay? It's only when it is brought and energized that it truly becomes a source of energy or becomes a vigraha. Okay? The very term vigraha means something that transmits energy. Graha means to absorb. That is why we say the planets are grahas. They absorb various energies, and therefore we feel de-energized depending on which graha is in our particular horoscope, etc. They say. Whereas a vigraha is one that actually is transmitting energy, and that's why we call a shila or a idol as a vigraha. Okay, so the prana pratishtha of the vigraha is done, and then there is a whole team, a specialist team made up of the sthapati. Sthapati is the master builder, so they have to select a sthapati, the acharya, who is the one who is the guru for the whole project. Then, of course, there'll be a director for the temple construction project, and then the key person who is the sculptor or the shilpi. Okay, the one who. So they are all the team that goes through the process. And when we talk about the people, obviously all these people have to be led, and that is where comes Vishwakarma, or the god, and who is also the inspiration of all these craftsmen and architects and builders. So, in fact, Vishwakarma Puja is conducted. It is not so popularly known. Somehow I have not seen it as being celebrated in Singapore or even in South India. It is very, very popular in North India. It is usually, I think this year it's going to fall on the 16th or 17th of September. And Vishwakarma Puja is the day of Vishwakarma Jayanti, when we celebrate this divine architect. In fact, he is the one who is supposed to have built Dwarka, and he built the Maya Mandira of the Pandavas, the fantastic Mahal, the palace that was the Pandavas, palace. So all these are built by Vishwakarma. And he therefore is the inspiration for all these arts, all these skilled people. And also finally, the number of arts, as we said earlier, is unlimited. And the Shastras say that the rules, the Shilpa Shastra rules, they deploy 64 kalas or techniques and 32 types of knowledge. So you can imagine, obviously, all of these need the grace and the power and the energy of someone like Lord Vishwakarma to be of the inspiration to the people behind who will actually enable it in the human dimension on earth. Moving on, what are the notable design elements in a temple? So we have Vastu Shastra renders this whole beauty and structural stability through the management of light, sound, and volume in the temple. If you notice in the temple, such a lot of sound sometimes generated, but you just go away 100 meters of the temple and the whole sound is muted. Okay, so this is all part of this entire beautiful Vastu Shastra that is at the background or at the very foundation of the building of the temple. Okay, so the entrance porch usually is semi-open, allows for maximum light. Okay, the main, the entrance pavilion, and then the pavilion where the Sabha Mantapa, where all the worshippers sit, has moderate lighting with few openings, because the idea is to get the devotees in a mood that is not distracted by all the light and sound from outside, but slowly starts searching for the main purpose for which the person has come to the temple, which is to seek the grace of the Lord. And so his direction is started to happen. Okay? And then comes the Sanctum Sanctorum itself with a single opening in front, which allows the only light to fall on the deity alone, and nothing else is visible inside the Garbhagriha or the Sanctum Sanctorum, if you notice. Okay, in fact, in traditional temples, it will only be lit by oil lamps, with feeble oil lamps, where you'll only see the murti and no electrical light. And nowadays, of course, they shine electric focused lights inside, but that is not traditionally the purpose of a Garbhagriha or the design according to the Shilpa Shastra and the Vastu Shastra. And echoes are avoided by clever design of open spaces and structures, so that and so there are buildings where there's absolute quietness in the sanctity of the proximity of the sanctorum, because our whole purpose has to be able to concentrate with all our fervor and faith in the Lord. Okay, and so the shilpis or the sculptors, as we know them, in some cases like Meenakshi Temple, the Vijayavithala Temple, etc., and Hampi Vijayanagar, they displayed, in fact, a huge amount of ingenuity, that they had musical pillars. Many of you would have probably seen or heard about this, where specific pillars would give out the swaras, the Sapta Swaras, the 7, octaves. Okay, I think even in our Shanbhaga Vinayagar temple here, I think they have recreated one pillar, if I'm not mistaken, here in Singapore, Ceylon Road Temple. Okay, there is also a little bit of appreciation of the intricacies involved in this whole design elements that these Shastras have. They use a certain degree of unbelievable precision in their instruments, and they use specific standards of measurement. I won't go through all of them, but they use two large categories, one for delicate and intricate work and other for the larger structures. Okay, so they had all these terminologies. One hasta, that is one length of one arm, right? One cubit, right? In English, it's a cubit for a length of an arm. Then 4 hastas to danda, etc., etc., and to the point where we say 1 angula, which is 1 angula is 1.8775 centimeters, and then it's further broken down into anus, nool or threads, hairs, grain of sand, mustard seed, angulas. So even today, interestingly, these are the measurements that Shilpis use to this day for the building of the temples. We now move from that to the actual significant elements of a temple. I talked about some of these, but we look at greater detail. Okay, we know that the broad temple is how it is laid out. Let's go step by step. So we start with, of course, the most important, which is the Garbhagriha, which is the womb room or the Sanctum Sanctorum, and the Vimanam or the Shikhara on top. Okay, the Sanctum Sanctorum is the womb spot where the chief deity is sitting. It's worshipped there. And the Vimana we talked about is typically tapering. I'm talking largely in Dravida style. It's pyramidal. It could be concentric layers in northern style with ornamental rim and amalaka. It supports a pot at the top called a kalasha or a series of pots. Okay? Usually the pot itself is made of copper or gold or silver or alloys or even metal plated stone at times. Okay, so it could be metal plated, it could be gold plated stone, depending on the designer's, and what is needed for that particular devata who is the presiding deity. And then, of course, there will be that connecting passage, which is called the Antara Mandala. Okay, there's a small passage. Okay, there's also a passage where you can actually circumambulate round the Garbhagriha. Now, for instance, in Singapore, in the Perumal temple, you cannot circumambulate the Garbhagriha itself. It's only the outer thing. But there are temples you'll notice where you can circumambulate the Garbhagriha. And then we move on to the next element, which is the middle section, which are all the mandapas or the pavilions, okay, or the halls, basically. And there are various ways in which, depending on the size of the temple, you can have a very large hall. You can call the Mahamandapa. Okay, there are quite a few. For instance, you start with the front porch called the Ardha Mandapa or the half Mandapa. Okay, and then the front hall, Mukha Mandapa, a great hall, Mahamandapa, a marriage hall sometimes, Kalyana Mandapa, a decoration hall called an Alankara Mandapa, and a festival hall called Utsava Mandapa. So it depends, of course, on the size of the, but most temples, if you notice, even in Singapore, would have the Ardha Mandapa and the Mahamandapa. I'll come in a minute to the Vahana Mandapa. So the Ardha Mandapa is the more open one with full of light, as I said earlier. The Mahamandapa is where slowly the light gets restricted, and it is a place where the worshippers gather to view the god before through the vestibule which goes to the Garbhagriha here. Now there is also another mandapa there called the Vahana Mandapa. Okay, sometimes it is open. It may not be the home of mandapa. It is where the Vahana or the mythical entity or the animal which the deity uses as his or her vehicle. You know, in the case of Ganesha, we know it is Mushika, the mouse, or for Vishnu it is Garuda, for Shiva it is Nandi, the bull, for Mahalakshmi it is the owl, for of course Saraswati temples are very few, so on and so forth. Okay, and these Vahanas sit sometimes inside a mantapa. Here in Perumal Koil, if you see our own Perumal Koil, you'll see a Garuda, you know, which is an eagle sitting inside, and Garuda Bhagavan sits inside a covered mantapa here. But often there'll be Nandis typically may not sit inside a covered mantapa, they'll be open, except of course in the great temples of some of the great temples of India. We move on now to the next section, which is in front of the mandapa. We are now moving towards the entrance, okay, which is the Dvajasthambam and the Balipita. Okay, Dvajasthambam is in Tamil we call it the Kodimaram. Okay, Dvaja means flag or flag post. Okay, Sthamba is post, flag post, therefore, or Kodimaram, Kodi and Maram, because it used to be made of maram or wood largely. Even today, it is a long piece of wood, but it will be plated. Okay, and will be plated with, depending again on the richness of the temple or the design, whether it's plated with copper or plated with gold, etc. Sometimes not plated, pure stone, or could be wood. Okay, and oftentimes we actually prostrate to our devata at this level of Dvajasthambam, because this is where the energy sources begin. And I will show you soon the relationship between the Garbhagriha and the Dvajasthambam. And there is a very geometrical relationship to it. Okay? And often it will be decorated with flowers. It will have actually a flag post also. Then there is in front of it the Balipitha. Okay, it is the pedestal near where the priests will place offerings to not the main deity, to the other additional subsidiary deities which are there in the temple, and the other elemental forms of powers that are there, by way of rice mixed with kungumam or rice mixed with pepper, and other offerings are made every day. You'll see that they will go to the Bali Peetham and make offerings there. Okay? It is conjectured, we don't know for sure, that this might also be in the places where at one time animal sacrifices might have been made. That is why it's called Bali, or sacrificial altar. Okay? Bali Peetham. Okay? Peetham is pedestal, Bali is sacrificial. Presently, of course, all of them is a symbolic gesture. We move on then from there to the final exit, which is or rather the entrance, I would say, not the exit, which is the main tower, which is sitting on top of the prakara, or the surrounding boundary wall, which is of the gopura. Okay. Just quickly taking a look at the time. Going to have to run through a little bit more faster. Okay, the gopuram is therefore a multi-storied entrance. Okay, as I said, it sits on top of the prakara, and there are many other additional structures in the temple, like the kitchen, the structures to house temple chariots, the cows, the temple elephant, storing idols, there'll be a safety vault, to store the jewels, etc., palanquins, etc., etc. So there are lots. So a temple is a major complex essentially, and all of them are part of the design elements. I'm now going to move on. So that was what we saw in entirety. Let us take a look at a little bit more detail of the Sanctum Sanctorum and the Vimanas. Okay, as we said, Garbhagriha is the very purpose of the temple. That is the purpose for which the temple has been built. It is usually serene, secluded. It is a centerpiece for our attention. Okay? And in fact, I found it very difficult to find pictures of Garbhagrihas, because you will notice, in fact, in many temples, they will not allow you to take the camera inside. When I visited some of the temples in India last year, year before last, they wouldn't allow. So there's no question of taking Garbhagriha temples. Of course, in Singapore, they are generous enough to allow. But these are only a few that you can find in the net. And you can see that they're always secluded and very serene and quiet spots. Okay? And it represents the head and image, as we said. But very importantly, there is a certain symbology that impresses the need to seek the Lord within our heart and not outside. So that is the purpose of that whole, the way it is designed. Okay? We are seeking the Lord within our own heart. So we are not really going and seeking the Lord. He is only a representation sitting inside, and that is in the depths of our heart. The Garbha represents that. It's usually a cube. I think it's a small room, the low roof. Presiding deity usually faces east or north, by the way. Place is completely dark except for the light, so you can only see the deity through the light coming through the opening. Usually oil lamps. And the surrounding sculptures, by the way, are not too elaborate. They are modest in detail. Of course, in front, sometimes they'll have two guardian devatas, okay, called the Dwarapalas, or the door entrance guards. Yeah. And then we talked about this, that it conceptualizes the devotee finding his way to the secret inner place. We are reborn by getting the energy from there, and we emerge later transformed with the Lord's grace. I moved to the Vimanas. We talked about the Vimanas. I think I'll skip through this. The Vimanas have various parts. Okay, they are very detailed, as you can see. Okay, and now this is the architecture of the Vimana, or under which sits the Garbhagriha of the Brihadishwara temple, one of the grandest temples of Hindu architecture at Tanjavur in Tamil Nadu. And you will find, if you notice, that here the Garbhagriha is huge, okay, as compared to the Gopura, or the temple tower at the entrance. Okay? And this is the style that was adopted in the early stages, where the great key importance was provided to the Garbhagriha. Okay? In fact, this is part of the World Heritage Site. I had the pleasure of visiting this many years ago. It's simply stunning, and for many of you who have been there, you will agree. Okay? It's considered one of the greatest living Chola temples, where pujas are conducted every day. Okay? And it's a 16-story Vimana, and at 216 feet, it is the tallest Vimana anywhere. And the huge amount of stone was used. It's got In fact, as I said, the Vimana is taller than the two temple gopurams. And the image of Lord Shiva is there in all his 108 dance forms. There's a huge Nandi in front. Of course, here the Nandi sits inside a Vahana Mantapa, as you can see. He has a covering Mantapa on top. Okay, one of the biggest Nandis in India, 16 feet in length and 13 in height. I will carry on. There are lots of other features of this temple. By the way, this presentation, for those who are interested, it will be, I think, made available. I'm not sure whether we'll put it on the site, but for those who are interested, we can always send it. Here in Singapore, I thought I will also show some of our own Vimanas. This is the Veeramahakali Amman temple with its, this is the Garbhagrihas, where Amman is sitting here. I think Ganesha is here. And Muruga is on the right hand side, and those are the Vimanas outside on top of them. Similarly, this is the Dandayudhapani Tank Road temple with its Gopura and its Vimanas. Okay, this is the main. Muruga sits under this Vimana on the right. And then, of course, the Shiva temple. And if you notice, our Shivan temple at Gelang follows more the Nagara style. It is not so much the Dravida style. Well, you can say it is a bit of a, maybe it's a Vesara style. It's more sort of hybrid style. Okay. And Shiva, of course, sits under the main Vimana, okay, with Ganapati on the left and Shakti on the right. Moving on, I move to the Dvajasthambam significance. I'm going to touch upon the significance of just the key elements now. That's what, if you notice, I'm doing with pictures after doing the sketch variety earlier. Okay. As I said, Dvajasthambam usually wood or stone plated by copper, silver, gold, etc. This is where the relationship comes about. So usually there is a relationship between the top of the crown of the Vigraha or the brow, the brow of the main idol, and the top of the Dvajasthamba. And the Shilpa Shastras say that it has to be at 22.5 degrees, okay, from the midpoint between the brows of the idol to the top of the thing. And that determines, obviously, the distance. The trigonometry of this determines at what distance the Dvajasthamba should be from the Garbhagriha, the idol, okay, the Murti, basically the main Murti. Okay. And for that reason, I am told in one of the recent reconsecration of one of the local temples, the Dvajasthamba was slightly shifted to make a correction to what was apparently a slight difference in measurements. Okay. So there is such an important, and this 22.5 degrees is very interesting because the angle at which Mother Earth is tilted to the plane of its circumambulation or rotation around the sun is roughly somewhere between, it shifts between 21 to 24 degrees, which is what causes the seasons, okay? And at some point of time, probably, I think now it is at somewhere around 24.5 degrees, but it is said at one time it was at 21.5 degrees. So probably at the time of the Shilpa Shastras, I am conjecturing here, it was around this degree, and there is apparently potentially a relationship between the tilt of Earth to the tilt through the angle of this, relationship. Okay. Moving on, I now come to the Murti. So this is the most interesting part. So bear with me because we are going to maybe overrun time a little bit. Then the Murti or the idol is obviously the most important part of the temple. There's a very reason why we visit the temple or why the temple is built, as you said earlier. And in our tradition, of course, symbolism is key. Everything is symbolic. Okay? And the key point is that we are worshipping not really God himself there, but a reflection of the God, of our God, what we call as a bimba, or a pratima, or a copy, or a representation. And he's a reflected image of the God, because God is everywhere. God is sarvavyapi, and therefore we, for our purposes, because we are limited in size and we are limited in our abilities to travel to places, we therefore see him reflected there. So it is not as if God only resides in Tirupati or resides only in Serangoon Road and Perumal Koil, right? It is, he's there everywhere, and therefore he is a bimba. This is important. And therefore, he is worshipped in a temple is an idea. The temple itself an idea. It's a concept. It's a conceptual imagination or a mental image of the God, which is translated into stone or metal for our limited because we have limited abilities for our understanding. And there are many terminologies for these idols. They call it Bera, Murti, Vigraha. I explained to you Vigraha, Pratika, Rupa, Archa. Archa, that is why we say use the word Archana. Archana is, it is an object of adoration or adulation and worship. Therefore, to the Archa, we do Archana. We are giving our all that we love to this Archa. Okay? And the Shilpis study these dhyana shlokas or verses which they have to contemplate on, because these verses actually determine the various dimensions of each murti, the postures, the bhangas, okay, first of all, whether they're dynamic or static or seated or dancing, what kind of posture it is, the mudras, which in the hand gestures, the attitudes, whether they are in ugra, which is angry form, or they are in, sattvika, very calm form, etc. Their consorts, who is whose consort, okay, and other various details, which essentially then provides that power and grace with that murti, and gives us that awe and inspiration which we get during our good and not so good times. Okay, so here is an image of Lord Narayana. Typically, the Shilpa Shastra, the Shilpis, from the Dhyana Shlokas actually say that he should be either made, Lord Narayana should be made either with 10, 8, 4 or 2 arms. So you'll never see him with the odd number of arms. His neck should be in the form of an umbrella. His neck should be like a conch. His head should be like a form of umbrella. His neck should be in the form of a conch. His eyes like sukti or oysters. His ears, sorry, not eyes. His eyes should be, by the way, like lotus. I have not mentioned it here. Okay, Kamala Lochana, they say. Lochana, eyes are like lotus. His should have strong thighs, arms. His breast or sthana should carry the Srivatsa mark. He should have the Kaustuba gem, the gem that came out of the Samudra Manthan, the churning of the oceans. He should be dark as the atasi or flax seed, the flax plant. It's a kind of a deep purple. He should be clad in yellow robes. Interesting, because even for Chinese also, there is auspiciousness with yellow robes, right? He should have a serene and gracious countenance. He should wear a diadem or a tiara, a crown like with which is coronated, and earrings, okay? He should have either 8 hands or 4 hands, okay? And what should they carry? What kind of, weaponry, and what should they carry? The sword, the mace, arrow, etc., etc. And then the images in the temple should be achala. Some images are achala, that is immovable. Chala means to move. Achala means not movable. Okay, and usually what happens is the achala image of the deity is placed in the sanctum, because in the form of a stone, and will not be moved. Okay, and then the temple has got actually 5 other kind of representations. Sometimes we see a few of them we may not recognize. After this talk, I hope we will be able to try and make out what are the murtis that are there. Especially you see this in the Perumal Koil here, Srinivas Perumal temple, they used, and they are typically what is known as the Kautuka Bera. Bera means, as I told you, murti, right? Which is the mini replica. It's made of copper, silver, gold. It's placed in the sanctum near the main idol, and it is connected to the main idol with a small metal silver string or silk thread. Okay, and it receives all the daily worship that the main idol receives. Okay, and we find this in the Perumal Koil. Now that I'm telling you, you might recall seeing the Kautuka Bera. And then there is the Snapana Bera, which is usually smaller, even smaller. And this is the one that receives the daily Abhisheka, or the ornament, or the bath, the sacred bath every morning. Okay, Snapana Bera. And then the Shayana Bera. Shayana means in sleeping posture. So this is the images or idols with which the Lord is put to sleep. Okay. Then there is the Utsava Bera finally. Okay, which is the idol that is taken out in ceremonial processions. So the one that we carry as in the palanquin is called Utsava. Utsava means celebration, and therefore this is the celebratory or ceremonial thing. And there is also a Bali Bera, okay, which is taken out daily around the central shrine when food offerings are made. It's a very small icons. You can see that they'll carry it usually with the covered food offering as the priests walk around the temple in the morning making the offerings. Okay, so there will be this Bali Bera. So these are the 5 different replicas of the main Achala image that is inside the temple. Okay, we now move on to iconometry or the measurements. Okay, so our dhyana shlokas are very particular about even the, and that is the reason why it gives such beauty to the form and shape of Ishvara and the different devatas. Okay, and so you have, in fact, these measurements. You know, earlier you may have missed the, seen the words which are there. Angulas I talked about talas. I didn't read out the word tala. Okay, tala is, I think, 12 angulas. Okay, and therefore these are measurements in angulas, by the way. So 7 tala a figure, or an 8 tala figure, or a 9 tala figure. Okay, so these are the various talas. So every idol has to have these measurement and gives you the total. So the Shilpi knows how to actually structure them, and you can see the breakdowns of the different sizes. Okay, so whether it is a female god or a male deity, everything is already laid out for each type of deity. And for the Ugra or the more demoniacal or the Asura figures, whether it is Ravana, Hiranyakashipu, etc., they have a 16 tala measure. Okay, and that's the reason why there is a certain asymmetry, and when we look at the very figure, we feel a bit uncomfortable when we see the figures of the demons or the asuras, whether it is Kumbhakarna, etc. So the dhyana shlokas of the Shilpa Shastra tells us very clearly. Okay? And then comes to the postures, which are the sthanaka posture, which is the standing posture. Sthana means location or located. Okay, and there are many postures. First is the abhanga. Abhanga means it is steady but with no breakdown. It's just straight. Okay, then comes samabhanga. Samabhanga is symmetric. Both sides half. They look exactly the same. They are symmetric. The previous one was asymmetric and steady. This is symmetric. The next is dvibhanga. Dvi means always 2. Dvibhanga, in 2 bends. The idol is got 2 bends. This is the image of Rama. Okay, and it is in 2 bends. Dvibhanga. Then you have tribhanga. This is usually a dancing posture. So here this is Krishna doing the Kalinga Nartana on Kalinga, the Naga or the serpent, and he is dancing on it as he subdues it. So he is in 3 bhangas. So he's got 1, 2, 3 bends, right? And then finally you have Ati Bhanga. Ati means many. So these are typically dance poses, often in Ugra Rupa, meaning not in the Shanta Rupa, in the more aggressive format, whether it is Kali, whether it is Nataraja, doing Tandava, he is an Atibhanga, many bends, okay? Atibhanga. So the dhyana shlokas tell us the standing postures. Then we come to the Shayana postures. It talks about Yoga Shayana. Okay, there are 3 Shayana postures. Here, Vishnu is in Shayana posture, where he is in a yogic sleep. This is found typically in temples, forests, forts, hilltop temples, etc. Okay. Then you come to the Bhoga Shayana. Okay, this is the kind of Vishnu who is with 4 arms. He's got more people around him. He has got his concerts. Okay, these are typically the forms of the sleeping Vishnu or lying down Vishnu found in temples in cities. And you'll find this in our own Srinivasa temple. On top, if you notice, before you look into the Garbhagriha, Vishnu is lying there on top in Bhogashayana. Okay? Usually in populated areas you'll find them. And finally, sometimes, not very often, you will find Vishnu in Veerashayana, where he is actually holding his weapons, and he's got all his 8 arms holding various weapons. Okay, in this you can only see 4. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a picture of, but you can see him holding his weapons. Okay, and he's got his 8 weapons, and he's surrounded by the rishis, Garuda, his consorts. You have Hanuman, you have Narada, you have various other devatas surrounding him. So there are 3 Shayana postures recommended in the dhyana shlokas. Then we come to the asana or sitting postures. And look at the beauty, how intricately they have, they have sort of thought through this whole process. You have the sattvic asanas, the asanas where the idols are sitting in Padmasana or Yogasana postures. Sattvic means very calm disposition postures where he is in his yogic postures, okay, whether it is Shiva or Narasimha, okay, who is also in his calm posture, or Ayyappa, okay. And then you have Rajasic asana, where he is more action based. His postures are related to action, and these are typical postures of Vishnu, and you'll see Shakti or Durga here, okay. And the deity sits with one foot down, almost touching earth, and it's radiating majesty. It's very action-oriented form. It's not aggressive, it's not calm, but it is active. Its eyes are talking to us, right? And finally, then comes the Tamasic asana, where it is the Ugra Rupa or the aggressive Rupa, typically of Kali, Mahishasura Mardini, Chamundi, Durga. All of these are in this form, where usually she is not only in, with her eyes wide open, she's mounted on a fierce Vahana, and then she is usually sitting on a beast, here in the case Mahisha or the buffalo, okay, buffalo-headed Asura, and she is, with one foot almost touching the ground. So all the three asana postures, and then sometimes there's also the Yana posture, which usually Garuda and Hanuman take, which is the supplicant posture, as devotees to the Lord. Then the Dhyana shlokas tell us about the various weapons that the Shilpi has to choose and pick, whether they are ayudas, okay, whether then he talks about hasta mudras, what kind of hand gestures. I'm not going into every detail of each kind of mudra. Then the pada mudras, the feet gestures. So you can see the combination in this of the pada mudra and the hasta mudra, finally how it evolves, okay. And then it talks of the various kiritas, whether it is a kirita makuta, which is various makutas, whether it's a crown, whether it is a lesser crown, karanda makuta for the lesser deities, then jata makuta. Jata means matted hair locks, locks of hair. Okay? And then, of course, for Nataraja, it talks about prasarit jata, jata being hair, how his are flying, in his Tandava dance. And finally, of course, there is a specialized for Agni in the form of his Agni, the hair as Kesha, Agni Kesha. And finally, we come to Alankara, adornments and jewelry. There is clear recommendations of all kinds of jewelry. The alaka chuda, for the gala, for the arms, gala band. I can't even read these now. The katibandha, the abharanas, okay, and even for the padas, and connected makutas, and then postures along with what kind of ornamentation is needed, alankaras for each posture. So you'll find a complete, the murti is treated completely, and therefore now I link you back to that much earlier description also about the Vedic needs for Kalpa Sutras, where it talks of rituals as to how exactly we have to carry out the ritual. So for each Devata in his Rupa, when they do the ritual, the Shilpi should know that in this particular temple, for if this is the main god, because the rituals will be conducted in this way, there is a connection, and therefore he has to accordingly choose or select from the Dhyana shlokas which are the correct, alankaras, hasta mudras, pada mudras, etc. And they link back. I know I'm going to take you quickly through Hindu temples in Singapore. I think I've covered the main parts of what are the architectural elements of what we call as a Devalaya Vastu Shilpa. Okay, and I wonder how many of us know how many Hindu temples are there in Singapore. I'm sure there may be some slight numbers, but then it was not so much to test your knowledge. There was somewhere around between. In my count, there are 27, but if you include some of the others, etc., which some people might say that the Raghavendra Swami temple is also a temple, then there are probably close to about 35 temples. Okay, But the key thing is, what is the defining characteristic of most of them? Okay? And this is something that we could consider looking at, because we looked at all the various parts of the temple, but one that will strike us is, of course, what? Nothing but the gopura, right? The first thing, ornamental term. So I thought I'll take you through a very quick tour of the gopuras that we have. Okay. The gopura, oh, we did not touch on the gopura, sorry. Let me quickly tell you about the gopura's details. Usually gopuras are very large. There are sometimes in all four entrances, sometimes the main entrance, okay. Usually east facing, okay. It has got stories, halls, courts. It's usually a barrel vault with yali, this mythical creature called a yali as guardian. It has kalashas on top, or pots, okay. Again, they are filled with various dhanyas and other ratnas, okay. And then the sculpture has usually the presiding sculpture of the presiding deity on the gopura itself. Okay, here this is from Veeramakali Amman temple. You can see Kali is riding her Bahana, the tiger or lion. Okay. And then there will be religious episodes which help devotees visualize and retain in memory what exactly. So the next time we go past the temple gopura, maybe you can take a look and see whether we can relate to some of these stories. You can see here Meenakshi being given away as a bride by Vishnu to Shiva in this bottom picture on top of this gopura. Okay. These are all sort of snapshots of various gopuras. And then there is this gopura with this Samudra Manthan, or the churning of the oceans picture, with the Devas on one side and the Asuras on the other side. So gopuras will reflect all these stories of from our Puranas and our Itihasas in the various levels, and depending on the elaboration of the gopura, we will see this within the gopura. Okay? And usually associated with the presiding deity. It will have a connect with the presiding deity. This is the biggest gopura of all. Okay. This is at Srirangam in Trichy, okay, in South India. 13 stories, 240. So with the gopura, I have finished all the main components of a temple. And so I thought I'll take you through the quick tour of gopurams in Singapore. That slide came earlier. Sorry about that. This is the gopura of the of our Srinivasa Perumal temple, okay, in Serangoon Road. This is of the Tank Road temple. Next time when you walk past, please try and take a look. Preferably walk into the temple, but even if you're walking past, I think it's worth taking a quick look and seeing what you can make out of that. Okay. This is the Mariamman temple gopura. We have some fine examples of gopuras in temple, and look at the original gopura on the right. Such a fine hybrid gopura with Chinese writing on the walls. This was in the 1800s. And then, of course, this gopura, unfortunately, I think was pulled down and a traditional gopura was built there. Okay. How I wish they had also retained this. This is the Mariamman temple in South Bridge Road. And then the two grand gopuras in one of Shenbaga Vinayagar temple in Ceylon Road, and the one on the right of Lion Siddhi Vinayagar temple, which both of them got consecrated, reconsecrated within the last few years, probably within the last, this one very recently on the right, and Shenbaga Vinayagar about 3 years ago. And then you have, of course, Gopura of Rudrakaliamman temple, Depot Road, the Gopuram of Shivadurga temple in Potong Pasir, and then the Veeramakaliamman temple, of course, on Serangoon Road, I touched on earlier, the Shivan temple Gopuras, Shikharas, I would say, in Geylang. And finally, the more modest Gopura in Krishnan temple in Waterloo Street. Maybe there are other gopuras too which you may want to look at, but I thought we'll take a quick sampling of the gopuras in Singapore itself. Okay. So next time when we walk past a temple gopuram, look up, admire, self-check what we can remember from all that we have learned today. I know we have covered a whole lot, but at least the gopurams is something that is easier. Inside, when we go to the temple, you can take a look at the vigrahas and then see whether we can make out. If you are there for the various worships, you can see what kind of beras they are taking around, whether they are small, they are portable, what metal they are made of, and be curious, and we can look at all this. I'm going to now stop there, but I'll give you a very quick look at some of the grand gopuras around the world, starting with the Meenakshi Sundarar temple. By the way, it is the Meenakshi Sundarar temple, often called the Meenakshi temple, funnily enough, Sundarar, which is another name for Shiva, okay, his Sannadhi or his sanctum is nearly 6 times the size of the Meenakshi sanctum in Meenakshi temple. But she is the main force there. So that's an interesting sort of comparison, I thought. Then you see the grand, of course, Vimana of Brihadishwara temple in Tanjore, the Galaganatha temple in Padatakkal, okay, in Karnataka, Padatakkal in Karnataka, the Konarak Sun temple in Madhya Pradesh, that's the Virupaksha temple in the Vijayanagar kings built this grand temple in Halebid, in Hampi, in Karnataka. And then you have one of the grandest rock cut temples. This has been entirely carved out of a single piece of rock called the Kailasa temple in Ellora near Aurangabad in Maharashtra. You can go to the various cave temples there, but this Kailasa temple is an absolute magnificent piece which will stun you and stun anyone into silence, okay, because it is one single, it was just carved out of this entire hillside, and therefore nothing is brought from elsewhere. It is one piece, okay? And it's got its entire insides carved out. It's the Kailasa rock cut temple. And then you have the Ramanatha Swami temple in Rameshwaram, okay, which is where Rama himself prayed to Ramanatha Swami, that is Rama Swami, and that is nothing but Shiva, okay, Lord Shiva, because he wanted inspiration from Lord Shiva for his, going back to, not to fight Ravana as so much as to get back his consort or his, life partner Sita. And then, of course, the grand Srirangam temple that I talked to you, the biggest Gopuram of all. The Brihadishwara temple, if you remember, is the biggest Vimana of all. The Srirangam temple is the biggest Gopura of all. And then, of course, here in Bali, some fantastic, Gopuras, done in their own style. But still, the Vimana concepts you can see very clearly, okay, with their guardian angels, etc., Dwarapalas. And then the unbelievable Prambanan temple near Borobudur in Java, okay, which was consecrated. This is the Shiva, Brahma, and Vishnu temple. This is one of the rare Brahma temples in the world, okay, with each of them having their Vimanas. You can see that basically they have followed the Nagara style of architecture. So I hope any of you, those who have not gone there, will after this presentation make a determined to go there. And then the next grandest of all, of course, is the Angkor Wat temple in Siem Reap in Cambodia, which is the size-wise, even though it's not a living temple, the size-wise, the area covered, it is the biggest Hindu temple ever built in terms of the total area covered. Now, this is my concluding slide, and I was trying to say something clever to conclude, and I was struggling for words, and then I thought nothing like plagiarizing someone else's words. I found a great description, and I thought, why not I share that with you? And it couldn't be written better than this by me. At least I could not have written it. The Hindu temples represent the culmination of social and religious aspirations of a society. They are the focal point in the life of a community and often represent its pride, identity, and unity. It is also a treasure house of art and architecture, designed according to the principle of Shilpa and Vastu Shastra, characterized by the majesty, serenity, and beauty of intricate culture and design. A temple evokes in us, the devotees, a sense of beauty in art and in life as well. It lifts up our spirit, elevates it to a higher plane, dissolving our ego. At the same time, it awakens to our insignificance in this grand design of the Creator. And what better way can we describe Hindu temple, its art, its architecture, and the entire grand design behind it. So with that, I'm going to conclude. I hope I have, in a sense, covered all 3 questions. If some of you think there are certain things that you would like to sort of share, you're most welcome to, which further embellishes this. Okay, and with that, I'm going to say thank you to all. I welcome questions. I don't know whether it's very late. We've reached 9 o'clock. It's 9:10 almost. So, but if there are some burning questions, happy to take them. Do please wait for the closing prayer before exiting the session. And we welcome your feedback on the session through email or through WhatsApp. And with that, Hindu Center, I will thank all of you on behalf of Hindu Center. I'm going to get back to my mode. Do I stop? You can put up your hand if you have got a certain question, and I will see. I'm trying to figure out. Susain, you may have to help me look for. Yes, Amulji.
Shall I? Okay. You can hear me?
Yes, I can. Very well.
Okay. Just a burning question I had.
Yes.
Like, if you see the temples at the Gopulam at the entrance and in the main body also, there are lots of other small murtis which we see, which are
correct.
I don't know is it relevant or they're all just Devi Devtas, is it? But you didn't talk about that. So I just
Yes, thank you for the question. I mentioned it very much in passing because that was the very last point which I mentioned when I was talking about, the mandapas, etc. So yes, you're right that there are a whole lot of other deities. For example, if you go to some Shiva temples, you'll find all the Arvati Mover or the 63 Nayanmars, lined up, who are basically exalted gurus and great devotees. If you go to Vishnu temples, you'll see the Alvars, they are all lined up there. Besides that, there are subsidiary deities like the like Bhairava deity, like Chandikeshwara, etc. So yes, they are, but they will all be in some way or the other connected to the presiding deity. So our Shilpa Shastras and the Agamas do recommend who goes with whom. Of course, there are the rarities, like you have the Shiva Vishnu temple. Okay, these are the specials where you have both Shiva and your Vishnu. Okay, which are specials, and it is not as if that they are not allowed or permitted. It depends on that. Therefore, the Acharya and that Sthapita, which I talked about. You remember the team, that entire team. So the Acharya gives the directions as to who, and of course, it will also have the blessings of the king or whoever at that time supported that entire project. Okay, so you're right, there will be many other structures in the, if you see for instance in Srinivasa Perumal temple in the Mukhamandapa, which is the main hall, you'll see, look up, you'll see the Dashavataras to one side. No? That's what I think you're referring to. You'll see Dashavataras. Then there'll be other subsidiaries. You're right. Thank you for that. Yeah, very good question. Yeah, very relevant.
Dada, Devan here. Namaskar.
Namaste, Devanji.
How are you, Pa?
Very well, very well.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I just got an invitation just a couple hours before this, and I'm glad I brought my wife along to listen in also. I got a very quick question, and this is actually in context of what's happening now around the world.
Yes.
As I understand, just like Singapore, many other countries, especially in India, the temples are closed, at least at the front door, while the archanas are all happening inside.
Yes.
If the temples were built with a certain purpose, wanting devotees to come in and recalibrate, as I call it, calibrate your gyro, your inner gyro.
True.
And with the current conditions where doors are actually closed, the reason being they don't want people to congregate and pass on the viruses as such. But what then gets missing here? What then lessens the power of what's inside the Garbhagriha, and what needs to be done? What do you think may be the solution to this after everything comes back normal? Because I do feel something is missing. The connection, not being able to get into a temple, and the doors being closed and not being able to even watch it from outside. Just simple question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. And here I'm going to sort of risk my own interpretation from my readings and my understanding, etc. The key point to understand is that the presiding deity or the main murti or the inside, it is a source of energy and it radiates, as I said, it transmits power to us. Okay, and it is after all a reflection or a bimba. It is only it is not It is not God. It is only a bimba. So the bimba has the ability to take on energy, and that is why the prana pratishtha is given. And that also means, since it has got, it is being, prana is being fed into the bimba, it also means by that token that prana also emerges out of the bimba, and it therefore diminishes in its prana, okay, in its energy. And that's precisely why our temples are always reconsecrated every 12 years. It is not merely a maintenance, the maintenance, people sort of mistake it to be maintenance. It is to do with actually infusing back all the energy that we, I call ourselves, I don't want to use the word sinners, but we who are papis, who are carrying our so-called, our own problems, etc., to get energized, are in a way diminishing that energy source, and therefore that energy source is to be re-energized. Now, in terms of the COVID, my own interpretation is this, or my thinking, and I will be happy to sort of discuss this, that I think the prana inside the temple is not being diminished during this period. In fact, if anything, if we go in there, every time we only give impurities, we carry our impurities in, even when we are inside the temple, are we totally focused on the murti? We are actually looking at the phone, we are talking to someone, we are worried about the archana taking place, we are worried about the guests, etc. So in a way, we are actually de-energizing through our not so good deeds. And therefore, I think the closure of the temple in a way is, you can say, we are not carrying further impurities into the temple. That is what we would have done. So I think, in terms of the societal norms, it is a safe process. But in terms of the temple and its prana itself, I don't think any prana is being diminished now. And therefore, I think I leave it there. I don't know if I sort of answered in some way your question.
I hope that's the truth, because nobody knows whether this has happened before and what are the effects of it. But we keep faith. Thank you.
May I just add on? The temples. Sorry.
Bit of an echo.
Okay, the temples are still doing their pujas. Most of the temples are still doing their pujas, even the doors are closed inside. Especially pujas like Pradosham, Kartikeya, and all this kind of pujas a temple should do if they have consecrated the particular deity. That is still ongoing. So, yeah, the question of energy or prana diminishing is not actually possible.
Thank you.
Raji, I want to ask a question.
Yeah. Yes, please.
Okay. This shastras, this agama shastras, are they shrutis or smritis?
They are shrutis. They are treated as shrutis. Okay, because they were also revealed
Shrutis.
to
Okay,
the rishis. They were revealed to the rishis, and subsequently they were then converted into texts, various texts, and of course then further improved upon. But essentially they are treated as shrutis.
Okay, then there are certain temples that has got their own rules, like only ladies are allowed, or another one is Sabarimala is another example. Are they also already in the Shruti, or it was laid down by men? Yes.
No, you see the word agama, we have to be careful. The word agama, gama means to go, okay? Agama means they have come down to us. So it's a very broad term, okay? So therefore everything that has been handed down to us, handing down is agama, is sometimes called by the generic name agama. So for instance, Manusmriti, which also sets the rules, and usually Manusmriti had also rules around to do with how women and men are treated, etc. Sometimes there have been a lot of debates around that. So it is treated as part of an agama, in generic terms. But if you take the main agamic texts, they are all shrutis, and they have not talked about these differentiations between, for instance, a temple to Ayyappa should not permit women or etc. like that. That is not there in any of the agamic texts. These are subsequent sort of, you can say, smriti rules that were overlaid, okay, on the agama, which are human sort of a human origin. I know it's quite late, so any other questions? Anyone has questions? I mean, you're welcome to even email them, and I'll to the best of my capability, happily answer them. But if there's anyone with any particular burning question, if not, we can move to the closing prayers. Anyone? Sushan, anyone? I can't see the hand raised. Okay, there is someone apparently. Could you ask your question?
Is there, this is Vijay here. Is there anything like, women should not go to a temple on a particular day? And you just mentioned about the Ayyappa temple, which was, a human-made rule later on. Is it something like, if we overrule those rules, it is going to be an error that we are making?
I mean, this is not, I mean, as far as, I mean, our topic today has been on temple architecture. So I have sort of not delved into so much the rules of who can, at what stage, who can enter a temple or not. That was not really so much the focus of my talk. But I think I will hazard the answer here talking about that if we are in any sort of impure disposition, okay, of relative, not in a relatively normal state of being, even if, for instance, if I am in a extremely, let's say, difficult mood, of course, people will say that's the time when I should go to a temple, but I need to control myself and go to a mood when I am a little bit more calmer, so that I get the main benefits out of the temple. Because if I'm in a distracted mood, so hygiene or impurity of any kind, whether it's physical impurity or whether manasic, there is mental impurity, one therefore then when we go to the temple will not be getting the best benefit out of that, because my mind is now sort of distracted, right? So I think probably the practices come from that angle, and of course there's been a lot of debate around this, and I will not say what is right and what is wrong, but I'm just sort of giving you my sort of take on this whole thing. Of course, I've not studied in great depth, and that was not the main sort of focus of today's sort of presentation. But I hope, in a way, it answers your question.
Yes. Thank you.
Any others? Okay, if not, I'm going to close this session by going back, sharing the screen for share. Okay, I'm going back and I'm going to do our closing prayers. You're welcome to join me in the closing prayers. सर्वेषां स्वस्तिर्भवतु, सर्वेषां शान्तिर्भवतु, सर्वेषां पूर्णं भवतु, सर्वेषां मङ्गलं भवतु, सर्वे भवन्तु सुखिनः, सर्वे सन्तु निरामयाः, सर्वे भद्राणि पश्यन्तु, मा कश्चित् दुःखभाग् भवेत्। Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om. Thank you very much from me and from Hindu Center.